On the afternoon of September 8, 2022, the tone of British television shifted. Regular programming stopped. News presenters changed into black attire. A statement from Buckingham Palace appeared on screen. Doctors were concerned for the health of Queen Elizabeth II at Balmoral Castle. Within minutes, the world understood something was unfolding. Royal family members rushed north to Scotland. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd began to gather. Not summoned, not organized, just drawn there by instinct. Then the confirmation came. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. 70 years of reign condensed into a single sentence. Across London, the Union Jack was lowered to half-mast. The BBC activated Operation London Bridge, a protocol rehearsed for decades but never before executed. Church bells tolled. Screens in public squares displayed her portrait. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. Some wept. Others simply stared, as though the architecture of stability itself had shifted. For most of the population, there had never been a Britain without her. She had appeared on currency, in Christmas broadcasts, in times of war and crisis. Prime ministers came and went, 15 of them, but she remained. Through Cold War tension, decolonization, the digital revolution, Brexit, and a global pandemic, her presence had been constant. And now, suddenly, it wasn't. At Windsor, at Edinburgh, at Cardiff, at Belfast, flowers accumulated in growing layers, children placed handwritten notes between bouquets, veterans saluted, tourists lowered cameras. The monarchy, often debated and criticized, was momentarily united by the gravity of absence. It was not only the death of a sovereign, it was the end of a living link to another century. Yet beneath the pageantry that would follow, the gun salutes, the processions, the formalities, there lingered a quieter question. How does someone become so woven into national identity that their passing feels like a generational fault line? To understand that silence across London, we must return to a time before the crown, before the coronation, when the young princess did not expect the throne to be hers at all. When Queen Elizabeth II was born in 1926, she was not meant to be queen. As the first child of the Duke of York, the second son of King George V, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor entered the world with status, but not expectation. The throne belonged to her uncle, Edward, Prince of Wales. Her early years were shaped by relative normalcy within royal boundaries, private tutors, structured routines, and a family that prized duty over display. She was described as composed, observant, disciplined. No one yet saw in her the outline of a monarch. She was simply Lilibet, a nickname born from childhood mispronunciation. Everything changed in 1936. Edward VIII chose love over crown, abdicating the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. The decision sent shockwaves through Britain and beyond. Elizabeth's father, reluctant and unprepared, became King George VI. At 10 years old, Elizabeth moved from spare to heir apparent overnight. The transformation was quiet but irreversible. The young girl who had once lived outside direct succession now stood at the center of constitutional destiny. During the Second World War, that destiny hardened into public identity. In 1940, at just 14, Elizabeth delivered her first radio broadcast, addressing children evacuated from bombed cities. Her voice, steady and measured, carried reassurance beyond her years. The monarchy, shaken by abdication and war, found in her presence something stabilizing. She later joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, training as a mechanic and driver, a symbolic act that blurred the line between royalty and citizen. At 21, on a tour of South Africa, Elizabeth made a declaration that would define her life. In a speech broadcast across the Commonwealth, she pledged that her whole life, whether long or short, would be devoted to service. It was not dramatic, it was deliberate. Those words were not spoken in anticipation of immediate accession, but as a commitment to continuity. She did not seek the crown. It came to her through crisis and inheritance, and from that moment forward, personal choice narrowed beneath constitutional expectation. The girl who never expected the throne began preparing to carry it, not as ornament, but as obligation. In February 1952, Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya when the news arrived. Her father, King George VI, had died in his sleep. She was 25 years old. A tour meant to represent continuity instantly became accession. The young woman who had pledged lifelong service 5 years earlier now carried the title in full. She returned to Britain not as princess, but as sovereign. The transition was abrupt, almost clinical. No rehearsal, no gradual introduction. A monarch had died. A queen had begun. The coronation on June 2, 1953, became a defining visual of the 20th century. Broadcast live on television, a bold decision at the time, it brought millions inside Westminster Abbey. Cameras captured ritual layered in centuries of symbolism: the anointing, the orb, the scepter, the crown. For many households, it was their first experience of a global event through a flickering screen. The monarchy entered the living room era. Elizabeth understood instinctively that visibility would define survival. Tradition would remain, but it would now coexist with modern media. Yet the crown she inherited presided over a nation in transition. The British Empire was dissolving, colonies sought independence, geopolitical influence shifted after the war. Instead of resisting that tide, Elizabeth navigated it by reframing power. The Commonwealth emerged as a voluntary association rather than imperial structure. She visited former colonies not as ruler of territory, but as symbolic head of partnership. The transformation required careful choreography, preserving dignity without projecting dominance. Her early reign coincided with accelerating change: the Cold War, technological advancement, shifting social norms. Prime ministers brought contrasting philosophies to her weekly audiences. Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, each era carried different pressures. Yet the sovereign remained constitutionally neutral, offering continuity rather than commentary. That neutrality, sometimes criticized as distance, was deliberate. Stability was her currency. Public perception during these years crystallized around youth and composure. Photographs of the young queen balancing motherhood with duty softened the image of monarchy without diminishing its authority. She was not theatrical. She did not chase charisma. Instead, she cultivated steadiness. In a world recalibrating after war, steadiness felt radical. The balcony appearances following state occasions became ritual affirmations. Crowds below, the royal family above, a choreography of permanence. But beneath the ceremony was adaptation. Elizabeth was not ruling an empire expanding outward. She was stewarding an institution learning how to contract without collapsing. The young queen did not halt change. She absorbed it. And in doing so, she redefined what endurance could look like in a century that rarely paused. By the early 1990s, the reign of Queen Elizabeth II had entered its most turbulent chapter. For decades, she had embodied composure through global transition. But now the instability was no longer geopolitical. It was personal, public, and relentless. In 1992, a year she would later describe as her annus horribilis, 3 of her children faced marital breakdown. Tabloid headlines splashed private disputes across front pages. Then, in November, a devastating fire tore through Windsor Castle. Symbolism collided with spectacle, the royal residence itself in flames. The monarchy, once buffered by distance, was now fully exposed to the modern media cycle. Satellite television and 24-hour news intensified scrutiny. Public sentiment shifted. Questions arose about relevance, privilege, funding. For the first time in her reign, Elizabeth faced visible skepticism at scale. The institution she had spent decades stabilizing now appeared vulnerable, not because of war or politics, but because of human imperfection amplified through cameras. Then came 1997. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, triggered an emotional earthquake. As crowds filled the gates of Kensington Palace with flowers, the Queen remained at Balmoral with her grandchildren. Silence, intended as privacy and protection, was interpreted by some as detachment. Criticism surged. The monarchy's emotional temperature felt out of sync with public grief. Within days, Elizabeth returned to London and delivered a live televised address, speaking as a grandmother and acknowledging Diana's impact. It was a rare moment of visible adaptation, the sovereign adjusting tone to meet a new emotional era. The crises did not end there. The early 2000s brought further challenges: debates over modernization, constitutional discussions, the evolving identity of the Commonwealth. In later years, controversies surrounding Prince Andrew and the political turbulence of Brexit tested the monarchy's insulation from direct commentary. Through each episode, Elizabeth maintained the same constitutional posture: neutrality above noise. What changed, however, was the speed of exposure. Social media accelerated judgment. Every public appearance was dissected in real time, yet her presence, measured, restrained, became part of the response. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when the nation entered lockdown, she addressed the country from Windsor. The phrase, "We will meet again," echoed wartime memory, bridging decades of service with present uncertainty. The years of fire did not dismantle the crown, they redefined it. Elizabeth's authority was no longer anchored solely in ceremony, but in endurance under scrutiny. Crisis, once external, had become intimate, and still, she remained. Not louder, not defensive, but constant. By 2022, Queen Elizabeth II had become less a political figure and more a living monument. 70 years on the throne had transformed her into a generational bridge, someone who had met Winston Churchill and also welcomed leaders born decades after her coronation. But time, patient and indifferent, was beginning to show its presence. The Platinum Jubilee in June 2022 was meant to be a celebration of endurance. Crowds filled the mall, military parades marched beneath balcony appearances, tributes flooded screens across the Commonwealth. Yet observers noted her reduced mobility. Appearances were shorter, duties were delegated more frequently to Prince Charles and other senior royals. The Queen still waved, still smiled, but the rhythm had slowed. Behind palace walls, adjustments were being made quietly. Public updates referred to mobility issues. No dramatic illness was announced. There was no spectacle, only gradual retreat. Still, she continued to fulfill core constitutional responsibilities. On September 6, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, she appointed Liz Truss as Prime Minister. The image of the 96-year-old monarch greeting a new head of government circulated globally. It would become the last official photograph taken of her performing a constitutional duty. 2 days later, concern escalated. Family members traveled urgently to Balmoral. The palace statement that followed was measured but unmistakable. Then came the confirmation. She had died peacefully at the age of 96. There was no dramatic decline broadcast in advance, no public farewell tour. The final season unfolded the way much of her reign had, discreetly. The machinery of state moved instantly into transition. King Charles III addressed the nation. Black attire replaced ceremony. Gun salutes echoed across cities and Commonwealth capitals. The coffin journeyed from Scotland to London, accompanied by crowds lining motorways and railway tracks in silent tribute. In the end, her departure mirrored her rule: controlled, dignified, procedural. The institution did not fracture, it pivoted. But something intangible shifted, the closing of a chapter that had outlasted wars, scandals, and political eras. The woman who had once been the unexpected heir had become the longest-serving monarch in British history. And now, that continuity had reached its natural conclusion. When Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, it was not merely a funeral, it was the conclusion of a living timeline. The images were unmistakable. The imperial state crown resting atop the coffin, the orb and scepter placed with precision, the silence of Westminster Abbey broken only by ceremonial cadence. But beyond the ritual was something deeper, the awareness that a figure who had anchored 7 decades of public life was now part of history rather than presence. Her reign had stretched across 15 British prime ministers, 14 American presidents, and seismic shifts in global politics. Yet she rarely inserted herself into headlines. Her power lay not in speech-making, but in constancy. In an age defined by volatility, she became the visual shorthand for stability. Children who watched her coronation grew old beneath her rule. Entire generations knew no other sovereign. Legacy, in her case, is not measured only by policy, because constitutionally she did not govern in that way. It is measured in endurance, in ritual maintained without theatrical excess, in restraint preserved across decades of transformation. She oversaw the contraction of empire, the reinvention of monarchy, and the evolution of media scrutiny, without abandoning the framework she inherited. She did not choose the century she would inhabit, but she absorbed its turbulence and remained recognizable through it all. With her passing, the crown continues, as institutions do, yet something irreplaceable ended, the final thread connecting the present directly to the wartime past. Queen Elizabeth II did not merely reign, she endured, and in endurance she became inseparable from the era she defined.